by the way, this is where I think conservatives can take some L's, because I think too many conservatives are not willing to properly consider and explain and think about how those vestiges, how those policies that did exist for 100 plus years have an impact on individuals and communities now. And there are some people who would call that institutional racism. They don't mean that right now I can point to you a law in the books that's racist, but they're saying, look, there were all of these racist policies, and so downstream of that, even though it's a few decades later, there's still a lasting impact and legacy from that. So there's
but
people
the question
who would
comes
call
down to the prompt that got us on this is, do we believe we can trust the marketplace today to say that we don't have to ban an individual hotel owner from discriminating or not?
My personal answer is yes. I also hold the
that we can trust the market to do that today.
Yes,
I think so too.
I think so too. I think that free market capitalism is one of the most truly anti-racist things that exists. Because if you want to really
the color we really care.
Yeah, if you want to be a massive bigot and you've got competitors, then you're going to get out competed.
Get with the program.
Yeah, and unless you live in a very truly racist society, you're going to get out competed. You're going to get put out of business, because actually discriminating against people in an unfair way is a competitive disadvantage. Mm-hmm. So I'm with you on that. I just don't think that as a policy position, if someone came out and said, okay, we want to roll this back, we want to roll back the anti-discrimination policies, we want to roll back certain things that might come under the banner of civil rights, people are not gonna like that, because you're not gonna get the time to explain everything that we understand. We've thought about this through, but most people have not. They're just gonna be like, wait, so you want to be able to discriminate against people by race and by ethnicity and by all that? Like, no, I'm not with that. And so most people would be against it. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. I hope not naive about this, but I think that too often, is one of the reasons I'm doing what I'm doing now, too often you have political leaders, politicians, even just people in leadership positions outside of politics who view their job as to be a bean counter.
Micromanager.
Yeah, but even of the country, just to sort of say, hey, here's what people think, and so I'm going to shape what I say in the shadow of that. Mm-hmm. And I think that gets backwards what the job of a leader is. I mean, Thomas Sowell had this famous expression. You know, Thomas Sowell is, he's, I'm going to get it approximately right, but if he says something like, if you care about somebody, you tell them the truth. Mm-hmm. If you care about yourself, you tell them what they want to hear.
Yes.
And what I see in the landscape today is a bunch of leaders who tell people what they want to hear instead of telling them the truth.
Yes.
Now, that's not because they're lying. I think it's mostly because politicians, the class we've bred in the United States anyway, are mostly vessels, right? They're like mirrors. It's like holding a mirror up to somebody and saying that I want to reflect back to them what they're already sending into the mirror. And I don't think that's useful. I mean, my first reaction when I sometimes, not all my ideas poll well, and some of them still don't.
Sure.
and that's okay. But my first reaction when I see that is not, I mean, it's a rational reaction. It could be this. I'm not blaming people who feel this way. Hey, I have this policy idea. Let me put it out. Let me poll it. And then come back and see, wasn't particularly popular.
Yeah.
My reaction is not, oh, wait, let me figure out something else to say. Mm-hmm. My reaction is, well, first question is, am I sure I'm right about that? Is that really my belief? It's always a good thing to check. Sometimes maybe you should change your own mind on some things, and it's good to be open-minded. But assuming that's something that I really have conviction in, my real reaction is, okay, well, then how do I persuade people? I'm not doing a good enough job of persuading people if this is what people still think, and yet this is the fact of the matter, the truth of actually what ought to obtain.
Yeah,
got my work cut out ahead of me. So if we believe that truly we can leave it in this narrow case, I mean, we could talk about this on anything, but leaving it to the market to decide what who a business owner doesn't want to do business with, then if our problem is people aren't going to be convinced of that because that position can be easily caricatured, or, you know, I had a discussion the other day with somebody saying, well, that's going to be your problem when you get into D.C., when you say you want to shut down the FBI. I understand your logic for wanting to do it, that you have a clear practical plan for doing it, but they're going to tear you down based on the narrative that they spin up around it. My view is that I need to do a better job. That means I'm doing a pretty awful job of explaining why this is my position. And I believe that human beings are not animals, that we're subject and open to persuasion. Is that a naive view, do you think, or unrealistic in the modern world versus the old world?
Man, I mean, I hear you completely.
Yeah.
And I think it's difficult because even as a politician, or I'd say even any type of leader, but especially when it comes to politics, you are simultaneously someone who has your own vision and ideas and policies, but you're also a representative of a much larger population of people. So there's certainly a line to be straddled between both in terms of how you speak and in terms of policy, of giving people what they want and representing what they want whilst also forming your own vision. And I think a lot of this is also just, a lot of it is iterative, right? Because you can have a goal, but sometimes if something moves too quickly, I think to their credit, I don't even like to use the term the left, but the left is very good at this. They're very good at incrementally realizing their vision, right? Rather than just coming on day one and saying, okay, we want to just completely do this thing, and then people have a massive reaction to it. It's like, okay, just tweak that. We want to tweak that. We want to tweak that. We want to tweak that. And then there's a long-term vision. So say, for example, again, from even a conservative or a libertarian perspective, I know many, many libertarians, even anarcho-capitalists, who are like, we just want to gut the entire thing, right? Just blow up the entire, they want people to just abolish the entire federal government, right? We just need to get rid of it all, whatever. And I'm like, okay, like I can understand, whether or not I agree or disagree, I can understand that vision and sort of endpoint. But if you come in on day one and it's just like, okay, all of these things that have existed your entire life and decades before, I was even born, we want to kind of explode all that and do this. I think it can be deemed too radical by people.
Well, this is a fun conversation, because I think there's two things going on there. So maybe we can click in a little deeper here. I disagree that that's a desirable endpoint.
Okay.
Right. I mean, maybe you agree too. I'm not an anarchist.
I'm not an anarchist.
I believe that there are certain limited roles for a government to appropriately perform with the consent of the governed under limited circumstances. So there, like, I think that you say anarcho-capitalist people will say just eviscerate the whole thing. The problem there isn't the stepwise progression to it. It's that I don't think that is a valid end.
I think it's both.
Well, it could be both, but I think that
let's say
the question I'm isolating for, though, is one where so I at least reject the premise. Sounds like you agree that it's a valid end. Let's pick a valid end.
Okay,
that is still drastically different from the status quo.
Okay, let's say
the question is the path to get there.
Let's say that the valid end is simply what conservatives say: smaller, limited government. Right? Because the government is not small, it's not limited. It's gigantic. The tentacles are everywhere. I don't know how many alphabet agencies you guys have in this country, but
totally.
It's enormous, right? It's enormous. So even if the goal is that conservative approach of, okay, not abolishing the government, but reining it back even to what it originally was supposed to be when the USA was founded, right? The federal government, as far as I'm aware, as a Brit who has some awareness of this stuff, the federal government was never intended to be as large and overarching and powerful and complicated as it is in its current form. So even most conservatives, I think all conservatives would say, yeah, the government needs to be trimmed down, it needs to be cut down. But the truth is, whether you've got a Democratic administration or Republican administration over the decades, it still just continued to grow. The spending continues to grow, all of that. So if the goal is like, okay, we need to shrink down the scale, scope, and power,
massively
of the
shrink
government.
down, right?
Exactly. So we can make that.
Do you go in steps or do you go in quantum leaps?
Yeah, exactly. Right? That's a very, and I can see pros and cons towards both approaches, but I think the more radical the approach, number one, the word radical scares people because people just get used to things. I have an interesting point, by the way, which is and this comes from my experience in dozens of different countries and just observing humans, and I think the biggest conservative advantage, I think there's two. I think the two advantages that conservatives have, which they sort of underutilize in their messaging and narratives, is most people around the entire world, most people are pretty conservative. There are more conservatives in this world by far than there are leftists or progressives or whatever. Most people, so even what I'm saying here the reason why the incremental approach works better is because most people are inherently conservative. Most people don't like massive, very quick change in anything in their life. Most people don't like that. Most people have a fairly conservative approach to their life. I think the second big advantage conservatives have, of course, is that the policies actually, it works, right? You don't need to indoctrinate people into
They work on their own merits.
They work on their own merits, right? You don't need to put someone in a, re-education camp of, 5 years of university or brainwash them in school or whatever for them to come along to the principles, right? You have to, by default, most people would understand that, something like the police make sense to manage crime, or that there should be law and order, or most people should and want to get married and have children and have this whatever. You have to indoctrinate people into ideas like abolish the police, abolish the family, disrupt the nuclear family. Those are things you have to brainwash people into. And progressives have been very successful in doing that, right? Despite how poor and ill thought out many of these ideas are, they've managed to brainwash millions of people into them. And I don't think conservatives are taking enough advantage of the fact they're like, look, we've actually got, our ideas just make sense and they're more in tune with what's already in your brain and in your heart. So how can we sell this message and vision better? Which, by the way, to your credit, I think you were, of all the people I see out there talking, I think you're doing this very well. I think you're talking about many points that are just missing from these conversations. I love that you talk about purpose. I love that you talk about meaning. I love that you talk about family and the importance of marriage and the things that people know, but for whatever reason, again, maybe it comes back to the too much politicizing and polling and all this stuff.
Yeah.
People are kind of afraid to talk about these things that they just know to be fundamentally true, right? It's so obvious to me as an outsider even. It's a big problem in my country, but it's an even bigger one in the U.S. that absent fathers and broken homes are arguably the biggest problem in this country, right? That's something America's number one at, that America should not want to be number one at. And most people don't want to talk about that because it might upset people, it might trigger people, it's a little uncomfortable to talk about the breakdown of marriage and high divorce rates and the huge numbers of children growing up without fathers and single motherhood. It's not pleasant to talk about because we all know people who are coming from this or who are experiencing it and whatever, but that needs to come into the conversation. It needs to come into the conversation because it's massively important. So yeah, just to your credit, I love that you talk about the uncomfortable topics, and I like that, you go into the lion's den as well to do it. You're not just sticking to
not
the
running
easy
to lead
ones.
a political party. That would not be worth it.
Yeah.
You're running to lead a country.
Yes.
You got to be willing to talk to everybody, agree with you or not.